We have a panel that's going to come up, and that panel is going to be hosted by our very own, Craig Chapple. Craig, come on up and bring your panel. Oh, we've got chairs coming up for you. I feel like I should help out, but I'm going to invite the panel to come on up.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the final session of the day. So we can sit down. Sorry. Thank you so much. I know last session of the day, so maybe you're in the way of the beers. I think they used to bring beers in. I don't know if that's still a thing, Oscar. I can't remember.
Now's the time.
They used to cart them in first day. Well, all right. My name's Craig Chapple. As said, I'm the head of content at PocketGamer.biz. But with me today, I've got an excellent panel. We're going to discuss strategies for building the tech that powers today's top titles. We're going to dive into basically the crucial tech decisions required to develop and sustain top-tier games. But that's kind of enough of me talking for now. We'll introduce the panel. So if we just go down, Timur, if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. Teemu, Haila, co-founder, chief product officer at Metaplay. We do back-end tech for games.
Markus, Kiukkonen. I'm co-founder and CEO of Bitmagic. Bitmagic is a gaming platform where anyone can create games through text prompts. So you write a prompt and we create a game for you that you can then refine and then share with your friends.
Hi, Riku, Rakkola, founder of Future Run. We're a small gaming company currently building a multiplayer team sport game. Started last summer.
Hello, I'm Timur Haussila. Just a few weeks ago, I think I got to the 14th year at Supercell. I've been developing games and kind of many. I was starting our investment brands way back. Been leading Supercell ID, Supercell Store, and now focusing on the investment and kind of new opportunities that we can create together with them.
So basically, we've kind of got a who's who for this panel. Basically, it's going to be great. So the first question, to set the seed. So say you sit down to make a game today. What's the first thing you think about when it comes to a technical and live games perspective? Are there things now that you're expecting that you weren't 5 or 10 years ago? So what was the main things you think about now, and how's that changed?
You started first.
So again, we started last summer, so we had to do a lot of these, let's say, technical decisions during the past year. And I think just roughly splitting it in 2 categories. So you have your, let's say, core tech, like choosing the game engine, choosing the backend technology, whatever multiplayer technology you're going to use. I think that's a big thing because later on those things are very hard to change after you started development. And then there's, of course, tons of, let's say, smaller technologies that you can adopt. There's a lot of assets in the asset store, for example, if you're using Unity. So as a small team, especially we're 5 people, so we have to think about how to utilize those assets the most effectively. And there's been tons that we've been using during the past year.
Yeah, anyone else?
Yeah, I can add on. I think often how we think is like, what is the central to your idea? What is your vision for the product? And then essentially build internally things that are absolutely essential. And then again, like same thing for us as a small team, really finding those third-party solutions when they're not central to your differentiation and kind of like your unique selling point for the product. And maybe on the second question you were asking about the differences, I think there's a massive amount of differences, and I'll just highlight maybe the one which would be the just live service, how it has changed from the cadence point of view and frequency point of view. If we think about 10 years ago, maybe you have weekly events and you have a sale here and there, and then it has been evolving into daily events and micro events, and essentially then the whole live ops is I think a completely different beast from 10 years ago.
Yeah, and we end up hearing pitches from quite a lot of startups nowadays, and I feel there's a massive difference to even 5 years ago, where there used to be this idea that you can even prototype the game and then sort of figure out what the business might be based off of the prototype that you have, and that's just like 0% of what I hear today, which way more that the service experience of the game is part of the pitch. So then you incorporate live ops or whatever it might be. You guys have AI, which is really cool, into the very first beginning pieces. So I think that drags a lot of the big decisions earlier into the project.
Yeah, definitely aligned there also. Like, of course, like through years, like we've been developing our own systems, and we see like working with startups, like both you here, that like to expect that the company from the get-go could build systems that you can have even just to support the early betas of the game. So like tests, it's quite a hurdle, like because basically you need to have the systems from the get-go. And I think like most of us here, like we are building gaming companies, and still at Supercell we define we are the gaming company, and to have a service that like fulfills the need of the game team and like develop it by yourself with the limited resources is a massive challenge.
Actually, maybe elaborate a bit on that, but you made an interesting point about, you know, when you choose, for example, the engine at the start, the importance of that decision. How important is that decision just in terms of the long-term view of your company? So, correct me if I'm wrong with this question, but like your first game, you choose to use Unity, you choose certain tools to build that. Then you staff up, presumably, with that expertise for those tools. So then does that make it very difficult down the line to change kind of the tooling that you're going to use? So how important are those decisions, or can you just change down the line if you need to, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think you can definitely change during the way, but of course, changing mid-project is very difficult. So I think you're pretty much married for that project, or otherwise you're looking at, you know, a huge development time cost on between switching. So obviously, if you're building a, you know, very high quality graphics game, you need something that works on consoles. You have a, you know, you can choose Unreal over Unity. But for example, we are developing cross-platform games, so for us it's been very important to kind of like have that performance on mobile as well. So I think that Unity is still a better choice there. But never the case. I think you can change definitely, but yeah, it's just a lot of cost. So you have to be careful when you start the project. What do you need in your game? What are the feature sets? So you need to be a little bit looking forward in that way.
And kind of going back to, you know, you sat down to make that game, and we asked that, but like, what's the hardest thing about building the game? And I guess from a tech perspective, you know, what might you regret later from those initial decisions?
Any regrets?
I think at least from a previous company, we have built quite a bit of technology ourselves as well. So I do regret some of that stuff. So for example, we chose to build quite a big backend on the previous company for a game, and now obviously depends on what's on the market. Now it's a little bit better position now. You can get let's say much more sophisticated middleware at this point. So I wouldn't do that again. But then again, it's always depending on the company. And I think that many of the old companies that have existed for 10 years, like Supercell, they have a lot of the technology that they built over on that time because they didn't have any choice. So I think it comes to that as well. So if you're building something that you cannot find anything on the market, you have to build it yourself. But if you can, I think it's quite a risky move to build it yourself.
Yeah, I would add on that one, just the notion of kind of time to learning, especially if you're a young company, you just have to focus on your core product and then find all the means to speed up the development. So again, find those third-party solutions that could fit into your purpose if they're not essential for you.
And what are like, you kind of touched on this really, but maybe there's some other things you want to elaborate on, but like what are some of the fundamental needs of a top tier game today, and how has this changed over the years? Because that seems like, I don't know, games are bigger than ever, you've got more players potentially than ever, so how's that kind of need changed?
Remembering the days like when we, let's say, released Haila and Clash of Clans, like first of all, like, we didn't know even how to do live ops, and nobody else on the like Western market knew. And like our hypothesis is that we will keep the teams at like headcount of like 6 to 8, very small, and we are able to serve the audience. Like it worked for some time, but it's clearly like wouldn't work today. So the expectation, like how you manage the service, what kind of content you give them, how you manage live ops, not just like, I'm not talking about the kind of monetization events, but actually events that make the game meaningful. They require quite a different setup, not just on technology, but also on the kind of how you are managing the team and the life cycle. And then of course, like the expectation on the player fantasy, like the game is one media where you're consuming that, but they are expecting much more to kind of broaden the fantasy that they have in their heads. When they're playing the game, but they want to see content from influencers, from us, making massive video content for different seasons. So like, yeah, it's 360 change.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I personally found really interesting is that the ideal team for a top grossing game has changed quite a lot. I don't know if you guys are seeing the same thing, but like, for example, there used to be a time when you'd kind of have a designer, and that designer would do both the systems and the content and sort of the player experience over time. But now I think it's way closer that you have dedicated teams thinking about the systems, then another dedicated teams thinking about the content, and then you'd have dedicated teams thinking about just the scheduling of the content, right? And then that brings more and more complex tools to it. So even like the process of how do you get to high quality is like completely changed. And that's super new to me at least.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think as your game grows, and like the top grossing game, again, the amount of process and manpower you really and tooling you need for running that live ops, I think is probably the biggest realm. I think what Timur was also saying exactly. When you have a big game, you could run it in the past with small team, partially because the cadence of everything was so much slower. Now the cadence is essentially on hourly basis. So then the amount of events you need to deploy is very massive, and then thus you need quite a lot of team or then really good tech.
And I think the process comes there to like bring people together, because like now with bigger teams and like trying to offer more, like you're starting to have more specialized disciplines, even like inside this design, as you just mentioned. So you somehow need to bring these people together to make sure that they're aligned what the team is working on. So like that, of course, we used to, in the early days, think like process as a curse word, but now we think that like good process is something that like empowers developers to do something great. So it doesn't need to be something that blocks you. Like, it could be something that empowers you.
Is that like how this question mileage will vary, but like what kind of with the changes in kind of how important like the tech stack is, you can't just get a designer to kind of do these things. Like how big does the team kind of need to be for certain levels of game? So you're working on different kind of levels of games. Like what's kind of the team structure specifically, and how many staff are on those teams that help support the tech? If that makes sense.
Well, I think it depends on the game as well. There's obviously these very content-driven games, or super high, like a high focus on the, let's say, live ops games. There's so many different types of games, and I think it comes to that. But definitely, at least the team sizes have been growing. That's for sure.
Yeah, and really much about the kind of stage where the game is. That like, yeah. I think like that has also changed quite radically during the past decade. That like, I still believe that like good prototype, a good early access game, like you can do with like team from 5 to 10. But then in different stages, you need to be not just to have bigger teams, but different people in the team. To kind of like you have a rocket, you're launching a rocket in different altitudes. You need different engines. So like we don't see that much that it's just one team from the get-go that can deliver a game to a kind of live ops stage.
Yeah, just quickly adding on. I was running EA Studio before joining Bitmagic and founding Bitmagic. I think what Timur mentioned is like I even say that if you think about as a muscle sets, there are completely different muscles that needed for incubation and building an early product and coming into live, and then actually doing the live ops. So there, even from like team members' personality point of view, it's a very different skill sets and personalities that work best in those environments. So in a way, it's even two different beasts.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, we're seeing that also like throughout, again, different teams, different portfolio customers, where like the early team, as said, very small, but then there's at least 3 stages, right, where you definitely want to get to 20 people, and then with those 20 people, you suddenly start to figure out what's the basics of my, I don't know, customer support, and like what's the basics of my very first live ops rundown of like what's worth doing essentially. But then somewhere on the top crossing side, you're looking at 100, 150 people, and an insane set of like processes, tools, so on that makes that team effective. Where the classic example is like if you have, I don't know, five more small design teams within your team, each staggering more and more content. Like how do you even test that without those teams tripping over each other, uploading configurations, having different environments, like doing different builds that are not compatible with each other. Suddenly it's a technical problem just to keep momentum up. And you just gotta get up to 150 people so that you can have the content treadmill to feed the beast when you have 200 million players or whatever that is.
It's quite an enormous undertaking, to say the least. So I guess one of the questions I want to ask is, what considerations go into kind of building an internal technology or using a third-party provider, and then how do you make that decision when to use internal, when to use third-party?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like I think in the past, at least, we've bumped into situations where you kind of adopt the black box. I think that's pretty scary for developers. So if you use some service that you don't know, you don't have the source code access, and especially if the service that you're using is quite new, the company maybe not battle tested enough, there might be issues where something suddenly happens and you're cut out of that service. And then if it's a very integral part of the game, then that causes a huge issue. So I would first look into kind of like, if it's a very critical part of the game and the so-called core technology that you cannot change during the project, be very careful on who you sign up with. So I think that's where you have to really do some due diligence there. And as far as then let's say the smaller third-party tools or technologies that you use that you can more easily replace, I think with those, what I've been doing, for example, is just scouting the asset store, getting a bunch of different tools, testing them out, seeing if they fit the product, if they work well, if there are any issues, stuff like that, and then just throwing the stuff out that doesn't work. So I think you can use that mentality very easily on those tools.
Yeah.
I could maybe add on. I think there's a lot of cover by Riku, but I think often people think that, hey, it's really quick to do internal tool. Like it's not a lot of development effort, but then people don't often think about the overhead that comes with maintaining it over the years and the environment changing. And is your internal tool actually going to be competitive with the external third-party options, which are then commercial tools that keeps constantly developed by a professional team? I think again it depends really what is the use and how central it is to your product.
Yeah, very similar to thinking that now if we start developing a new tool, that we understand that we need to pretty much build a product team. That if you just build kind of solution, you don't have the maintenance team for it that takes the accountability what's happening there and manages the roadmap. That even if it's an internal tool, the roadmap should be strategic. So to some extent, independent, thinking big picture, not just serving the game team. Because otherwise, if you're just serving the game team, you're always one step behind. You're always just asked to do features instead of proposing new teams. So, but yeah.
Yeah, and for us, it's an integral topic, and I think buying makes sense. Otherwise, Metaplay wouldn't exist, categorically, obviously. But also, the way we do our tech is that you build on top of it, so you still end up in the same question, right? Of what do you want from Metaplay, and what do you actually want to make yourself, regardless of using Metaplay? And that sort of comes down to what is your secret sauce, right? What's the thing that you need to own and understand and become experts of, so that you can tweak it and make it amazing. And personally, I think a lot of tech is mostly just a necessary evil. You kind of need it to work, and please don't talk to me about it ever again, the maintenance part. But actually, Timur, I have a question for you. What if any could you highlight that there has been a secret sauce that truly was worth building in retrospect? I'm sure there's a bunch. You had amazing multiplayer tech back in the day when that didn't really exist, for example.
Yeah, I think of course the server back in the days, the server tech that we built, it was it's robust and it's still old school, and it was back then already old school, but it's built on robust foundations and learnings from from old projects from the developers. So that is definitely the right choice for us. Not maybe cheapest to maintain, but it's still I would say one of the most scalable backend systems. And of course, then identification platform that we built, our DAUs are on their own level. We made a decision to develop it internally, and that was definitely the right choice for us to serve our players better, to save their accounts, but also kind of understand our players a bit better. But there's been hits and misses. So misses often have been that like we developed something that nobody owns properly, and then it gets left there as a legacy. And then somebody like wants to take ownership of that, but like nothing is documented because it was done ad hoc to serve the need that particular team had one point.
Is there a point like when a company grows to a certain size as well? So maybe you started off using third-party tools, but is there a point where you have to start considering maybe we need to build our own internal tools that are tailored to what we want to do? And I guess what will be the reasons for doing that as well? But is there ever a level that you get to?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a point. Like, obviously, even when you start a game, you can calculate for example, in our game, we had to calculate, future server costs, what they would be per CCU or DAU or something like that. And of course, when you have a small team, it makes sense to adopt those things because building the technology from the scratch would be so expensive from the let's say the initial funding that you have. But obviously, if you would have, let's say, millions of players or the size of Supercell, for example, it becomes a different beast. Then, of course, with those player amounts, those costs can, accumulate quite a bit, and it might make sense for you to build your own stuff, and you can, obviously then have the funds to put a lot of engineering power on building those systems. But definitely if you're raising a seed round or some kind of like a smaller round and just building the core game, I think it makes no sense to spend that money on building technology.
Yeah, but it's kind of like, of course, like the bigger you get, the more kind of the supportive technologies or services that you're building become strategic. And if it's very strategic, then you kind of need to own it because the risk, as we discussed previously, can be too high that a middleware developer or company like gets acquired, and then suddenly like maybe the service doesn't disappear immediately, but it doesn't get the love required after that anymore. So like if we see that something is truly kind of strategic for us, because the resources that we have, we do consider always like should we develop it internally or not.
Yeah, and I actually have also a slightly different perspective of that because, again, seeing sort of what our customers have done, I think there's a category of stuff that is just the secret sauce, sort of, that for some of our customers have been like really clever asset uploading and asset generation pipelines or something, that they sort of build a small extension, whether it's inside Unity or on top of Metaplay or something, that allows them to, say, do some kind of redecoration game that has just millions of scenes and like unique furniture and so on. So that's like an asset data management problem at the core of the game prototype itself. So obviously you're gonna figure that technology out. And like you guys are doing AI, so I assume some amount of building is involved.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think maybe I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think it really depends on what is central and what is like the heart of your company, also from technological point of view. How do you stand out from the crowd? I think in general, like the market is so oversaturated at the moment that you have to have something unique to offer, and then from that unique, what are the technologies there that allow you to pull off something that doesn't exist yet? And then yes, you do want to own that tech, and I think like then making that your very strategic, even for small company to have a very strategic component in the company. But then I agree with Riku, you have to be mindful as you start growing, you have capabilities to bring in some of those technologies in-house. But
I guess it also beautifully crosses over, like you were asking earlier on a related question of that you sort of become an expert with the tools that you use, and you sort of kind of have an inertia from switching after the fact. Right. So in these cases, like if it is the heart of your company and you start building something, then you become an expert in the thing, assuming it's not a one-off that goes in the no man's land afterwards. But like you become really good at, I don't know, self-hosting, or become really good at AI whispering or whatever is the thing. And I think that's important, like building competence in the thing that's actually the heart of your company, which might be technology related.
And I think especially if you're more like building, I think oftentimes if you build multiple, when you get into stage that you have multiple games, then of course those synergies in building that you can bring the learnings from the previous game into a next game. So again, same thing, that it applies of course to game design and other parts, but it also applies to technology. Like I said, that there's a learning curve in technology, and then if you scrap it, you start from scratch. So oftentimes it's easier to keep building on the expertise.
how do you prepare for a launch to ensure that, from a technical standpoint, your game is actually ready to support millions of players? And how do you try and anticipate those numbers in a cost-effective way? I guess we've seen many like high-profile examples. If I just name one non-mobile game this year, I think Helldivers 2 obviously had that issue, but it's kind of almost a given that games will have this issue now. But how do you prepare?
Yeah, well, I think at least, but in the previous company we saw our own server technology and kind of didn't have the user base, and then suddenly we got to 1 million DAU in a span of 48 hours or something. So it's definitely difficult, especially with your own tech if it hasn't been battle tested before. That's the really tricky part. So obviously then if you're using some kind of backend engine now that has been tested in scale, that's at least easier in that way. But in any case, I think regardless of whatever you use, it's still you can prepare, but up to a certain point. Let's put it that way. Of course, something like if you have a positive problem that the game goes completely crazy, then of course there might always be issues. However, well you try to kind of get to it.
Yeah, I think again in general, of course, you can try to prepare from like load testing point of view and kind of like look at the player patterns, how are the early audience playing the game, and from them try to build some kind of understanding and load test the system. But yes, ultimately, I think it is really hard to prepare. I don't know if Timur will have more
No, of course, we have expertise, but it's still like it's always a question in the end until you get the load. Like you can do be prepared, but it's. Yeah, we've seen it multiple times that like unseen problems occur because there's some changes in the logic or some differences how you're doing matchmaking or how the soldiers in the game are like to have finding the path. So the multiple factors.
So I think in the spirit of making it more concrete, right? Other than it's hard, should probably try it first. But there's obviously a couple of things that you probably definitely want to have in place, right? Customer support, because that helps you recover from unexpected things. You probably want to have like admin tools to be able to give out resources to players in whether it's in compensation or just like normal daily operations. You probably want to have those load tests, so that you're able to have technical scalability. You probably want to have OTA update pipelines so that you can keep the momentum suddenly then when the game starts scaling. What else? That's already, it's a list, right?
Yeah, it's a long list.
It seems like you have to have these like long conversations with your teams though about like we're going to have this technical challenge, and then all the teams going to have to come together. Okay, we're going to have to do this, this, and this, and all work together in different kind of ways.
I even like right now, like your expression when I start listing the things goes like, oh god.
Yeah, I didn't even remember all of that.
But it goes together like every discipline in like game development. Like they have their own laundry list.
Yeah. I was going to actually say from how do you prepare? Like from Supercell's perspective, you've kind of had two things happen in the past year, which is you're launching a new game, which you launched Squad Busters, which had 40 million free registrations. So you had to. I guess that was a good indicator to prepare. I guess that helps. But then you also had. I don't know if it changed the number of players, but Brawl Stars had a massive surge last year, and. How do you prepare for like both different kinds of things? So not just a new launch, but you make a new update to your game and it's actually, you anticipate it to do well. But if it kind of explodes and does really, really well, how do you prepare for that?
Yeah, of course, I'm not a technical person, so but again, like once you've had the scale and you're kind of repeating and maybe you're going a bit, like it's easy to go from 5 million to 10 million than from 0 to 1 million. So you have better understanding how the technology and how the service is working, but as Teemu said, there's other things involved. Like if we mess up, if we need to take game to maintenance, like we are able to reward players, and they get a reward. They actually know that they knew the reward. The early days is that we gave a reward, and suddenly the diamond number went up, but nobody noticed. We said you got diamonds, but they didn't see the animation of the diamonds going up. So they're complaining to player support that we didn't get the diamonds. So you need to have a thorough we messed up. Here's the reward. Press a button, and then you claim it, and then the number goes up. Though on the background it was already on the inventory, but there needs to be a way that the player really sees that like you're compensating them. And
I was going to ask, like, they kind of touched on the next question, which was like, how do you plan for failure? So something slips up in your tech stack. Do you already have these kind of contingencies in place, and what kind of contingencies do you actually have to have in place? I guess it depends on what's going on, if the servers go offline or something.
I think most of like good developers are paranoid by nature. So all the time in your head you're running based on your own responsibilities, like what kind of load release you need to have. And the server guys particularly, though they always seem somehow like peaceful, like Zen masters, but like on the background they are like processing the data. So like when I've been leading like a game, luckily I've been in a position that I don't need to really care about it because I just trust them.
Yeah, I'll just add up. I think you want to touch something important, which is especially for early startups, like how do you communicate to your players? Like when something happens, whether it's rewarding, but again, like whether you have in-game messaging. If you don't have in-game messaging capabilities yet, what else can you do? So essentially just have the fire drill that you know that, okay, if the game servers are completely down and nothing works, how do you deal with it? What is your kind of like steps process there?
So it definitely can't just be, it's happened, what do we do now? You need to know before, like, okay, this is how we're going to tell players. Obviously, I guess you already know kind of probably how you're going to fix it. And then this is the reward we'll give. So you already know that beforehand.
Yeah, and you have tools for it.
Yeah, if nothing else, like, actually, like a funny anecdote, the very first thing that I ever built into our like Metaplay's pre-alpha dashboard was a way to give rewards to players in the eventuality that you have to ask for forgiveness.
Yes.
And the second thing I ever built was like a small label of, so what is the language that this player speaks? So that they can understand the message when it arrives, and so on, like, and decrease from there. But that's also part of our onboarding for new customers. So kind of saying, please, 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 please put this stuff into your game. You're gonna need it. So yeah, communication makes everything else possible. But then beyond that, actually, like the more advanced scenarios, because I feel like those are interesting as well, usually has to do with segmentation. Because through segmentation, you might have a subset of your players that had a bad time because, I don't know, something happened in Brazil, or like some data center went down, and you don't wanna talk to everybody all the time. Then suddenly you wanna start to be kind of communicating towards a small subset of your players. And that's a little bit more advanced, but it actually comes down to very similar like live opsy systems. So yeah, just have everything in place, up front. That's good. But also I think on the sort of previous question, one thing that is profoundly helpful, like, yeah, load testing in general, but actually, I don't know if you guys have it at Supercell, but like actual simulated bot players to drive representative load into the game, right?
I don't know if we're currently using, but we've used in the past.
Yeah, there you go, exactly. Where it's the same idea of like from 0 to 1 million, kind of difficult. Then it's going to be like different class of problems from 1 million to 100 million, like. So, and those problems are only behind like very advanced game mechanics somewhere deep in the system of like, yeah, your matchmaking stops scaling at 20 million players, but it's fine to 5 or something. So then you really need to try to simulate like a global scale hit to find all this really weird little corners that are going to break. And a lot of that is usually on the game mechanics side and not necessarily on the back-end systems side.
Right.
Because they're so interconnected at that point.
Yeah, actually adding on that one, I think on previous point, I think when you try to simulate load, one interesting challenge is that when you're doing a game update or an event that changes player behavior, it might be sometimes really difficult to actually design a load testing that would capture what's going to happen, because you don't know how, again, new feature, for example, change the overall behavior of players and their engagement within the game. So oftentimes then you're kind of like, well, we don't know what happens, and then you have to just be prepared.
I think we've got a few minutes for questions. If anyone has a burning question, this is your chance. This is literally your last chance of the day.
It's the end of the day, as you say.
Oscar, you've always got a question.
Well, it's difficult because you kind of covered a lot. I mean, I think the question that was raised earlier about, because you took me back to my old days when I was thinking about when we were launching PlayStation Home. And in that era, we didn't have access to cloud. We weren't actually allowed to use cloud because it was still new. Sony didn't like it. They wanted to do their own thing. We ended up having to spec the whole thing so we could deal with making sure it didn't go down. And I don't know if that skill still exists, but I imagine there's still some value. If you have some level of expectation of what your audience numbers could be, having some level of like box, actual sort of metal in a room somewhere of your own, and then burst with cloud is presumably still a useful skill. Do people still think about that, or is at launch is it just stick with the cloud and we'll think about metal later? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, I'll go first because we have this conversation fairly often actually, and maybe like you guys have color on it. But what we've learned over time is that no matter what your ambition level, like even if you want to be top #1 grossing in the whole world, usually in the beginning, the last thing you want to do is think about the servers. Like, not at all. So it's a gradient, right? From like, I don't give a damn into, hey, this is sort of business critical to us, and sort of like the vendor risk starts going up and costs start going up. So we see this path from, hey, Metaplay, could you please host our servers for us? Because like, please. And into, yeah, okay, could you teach us how to maintain our servers so that we can learn over time to become good at it, so that we have options if we want to bring it in-house into our own AWS cloud, so because we own the database and make sure that it's in the EU and not in the US or whatever. And then maybe offload the compute, only the compute, into a cheaper cloud, and maybe even in-house at some point, like hybrids. Yeah. But does that resonate, or am I hallucinating?
Yeah, I think it's something that describes the current situation at least. So obviously when you're building the first version of the game, you're building a prototype, for example, you don't want to think about too much about scaling. It's kind of like too early to really go deep into that. But of course, it's a gradient, as you said. Once you go further, you start to think it more and more, and closer to launch, it's very critical to kind of think about how you're going to handle it. So.
I just think it's especially when you've got kind of like a big brand you're working with and you've already got an idea of critical mass, which I think is the fundamental problem. Now, I'm very proud that we never broke. We were one of the few multiplayer launches on PlayStation at that era that didn't go down, and we did double the number we thought we would, but not double what we planned for, thankfully. But I think this is an interesting kind of conundrum for any developer, is working out what to do. Most people don't have this problem. It's only when you're dealing with a significant enough brand, the audience is going to come in, and it could really go bad on you if it falls over. I think that's kind of where I was looking at it. Anyway, sorry.
Cool. And I guess if there's no more questions, I think we are over time, despite what this says.
We're all good. No, we were running over a few minutes anyway. Thank you very much, guys. I think that was really excellent. And like I say, doing this planning for any kind of live ops experience or any kind of launch experience across the board, all of the topics you guys have covered today are massively important. And it's hard if you're coming at it as a relatively new developer, or if you're an indie developer, some of the scales that these guys have had to deal with. We should listen to that because it can be very useful to us anyway, so we don't fall into the same pit traps. Guys, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you so much. Round of applause, please.
Thank you.